Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and RedBridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture, and ideas. Good morning. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast. I'm Nick Dyrenfurth, head honcho of the John Curtin Research Centre, co-host of Curtin's Cast. I'm joined once again by Kos Kung Fu Kos Samaras. Good morning, Kos. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
It's great to be back, mate. Apologies to listeners. Some technical and general Gen X inability to organise our lives meant that we didn't appear last week. 1,000 apologies. We're back today, limbered up. I've literally been to my back doctor this morning. We're stripped down, ready to go pole dancing. Because we've got lots of data since you and I last sat down together. News poll, I think a fortnight ago, had One Nation at 29% level with Labor and the Coalition in the doldrums at 18. Pretty similar results from Resolve and Morgan. Across those three polls, the trend seemed to be that One Nation was easing back from its peak, but certainly not collapsing, holding steady. The Coalition had recovered a little. I think Labor best described as treading water. You've, of course, had your own RedBridge AFR accent poll, and I'm going to get you to explain to listeners what you did with preference flows. In a nutshell, we had two results coming out at 50-50 for Labor Coalition and a second model where you had the Coalition up 52, 48. The key takeaway, One Nation still polling very strongly. And in the meantime, you wrote a fascinating opinion piece talking about that the sort of frustration animating One Nation is not the same thing as loyalty. So what does that mean for our discussion of political realignment, and what can you tell us about that large sample of polls that we have, in particular RedBridge?
Not much has changed over the last couple of months. So you're looking at least 3 months of polling data that is fairly consistent. Labor's primary is hovering around 30. One Nation's in that space. The Coalition's in the high teens. Any attempt to suggest that we should be looking at a two-party preferred vote with Labor versus the Coalition is a bit far-fetched, really. The reality is that unless the numbers change, and they can, but unless they change, it is a contest between Labor and One Nation. And that contest is going to largely be in regional electorates, less likely in the urban environments of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, etc., where Labor will do a lot better versus One Nation. So really, we are looking at the same picture we've now been looking at for a few months.
So you're saying the Coalition's not retrieving any of the vote that it lost to the Hanson surge?
No, definitely not. We're not seeing any evidence that is occurring. There is a caveat to that, and that is in the state of Victoria at a state level. We are seeing the Coalition retrieve its support from One Nation, and One Nation's vote decline in a very substantial way. So
why is that?
They were polling in the high 20s for some time, and then suddenly a series of polls, including ours, show them in the low 20s or high teens, and most of that vote's gone to the Coalition. There is a portion of that Coalition base that was sitting on One Nation is going back to Jess Wilson, and that's really probably a manifestation of voters viewing the Coalition as the real change agent.
Yep.
But also we've got to factor in that, as we get closer to that Victorian election, we're going to see just how robust the One Nation vote truly is. So we are seeing some weakening there. More importantly, when we speak to these voters that are moving back to the coalition, they will highlight to us that they did harbour reservations around some of One Nation's policies, particularly on race, particularly on immigration, and view the Liberal Party in Victoria as a moderate alternative. And I think that's an interesting development.
Yes, there certainly has been greater scrutiny of One Nation's policies, its candidates, internal consistency and tension. There is a sense that people are now judging it as a prospective party of government. We saw over the weekend it's not the first time, but there's been confusion over its position on migration. But how much are people actually looking at One Nation's policy stance, and how much of it is still people looking at One Nation as a vehicle to express their pent-up frustrations with the two-party system and politics as usual? And I guess there is a distinction there between, as you're hinting at, between federal and Victorian state jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think the latter. It is very much, I think, an environment now where people are choosing to report to pollsters that they intend to vote for One Nation purely because of frustration. The challenge for One Nation, of course, is that they have to actually transfer that to an actual vote in the ballot box. And, yes, we have seen some evidence of that in South Australia and, of course, the Farrer by-election. But I would argue that in those two ballots, I would say that One Nation wasn't really tested. And what I mean by that is that what happens when you expose that group of Australians to a whole range of negatives that could be run by either the coalition or the Labor camp on some of the more contentious policy areas that they currently are espousing. And we've done that in some focus groups across the country. And I can tell you that once you alert some of these voters, not all, some of them, to some of the issues around industrial relations, domestic violence, her views about women's roles when it comes to parental leave, and other very similar positions, she loses support. Her only advantage right now is that these voters that we're talking about actually don't consume political news, and so they're not aware of any of this. So they will be, obviously, when the two major parties come next federal election, decide to turn the blowtorch on One Nation and run very significant campaigns on these very subjects.
How would that message get through them, though? Because we've been talking at length about the consumption of mainstream so-called legacy media, and that people aren't reading, they're not reading the same morning papers. They're not watching the same ABC, Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 10 news at 6 o'clock or whenever it is. It's much more diffuse, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, but you look at every leader's office. When I say leaders, every parliamentary leader's office and the construct of their media teams, all super geared towards legacy media. And and obviously that plays an important role in our democracy, in our country, but that's not where most of the public are consuming information. When we surveyed One Nation voters, that is people who have moved from other parties, whether it's major or minor, to One Nation over the last eight months, and we interviewed them and asked them, okay, so where did you consume most of the sort of politically orientated material that persuaded you to switch? And 95% reported it was online, but it was online in organic ecosystems, not paid advertising, not in their, not an ad that some party or One Nation had pushed out. It was in an organic environment. So this is the new paradigm we're operating in, and I'm not seeing any evidence that the major political players, as in those who are established in the political world of Australia, so to speak, have wrapped their heads around this new world. It doesn't just include podcasts.
Well, speaking of podcasts, not just our marvellous edition, but there's actually an interaction between the old and new world media, and we saw that play out with Melongate, which I read about for the Australian last week. So they're not two completely different silos. I mean, I thought it was a storm in the teacup. I thought Elbow, and most importantly his staffers, I think it was a bad judgment call to go on the Bush Deep podcast in the first place, but then it became a storm in the teacup. But I guess it brings it that you'll bring the polling line in here, Kos. Does anyone really give a rat's about what Albanese is saying about crown melons? Is that the name?
Yeah.
Crown melons.
Yeah, no is the answer. And look, the only thing I'd say about that is that staff that basically organise for their boss to attend and participate in a podcast have to be aware of a couple of things. The first one is, if it's a podcast like the one that Albanese featured on, and it's, I wouldn't say controversial. There is a lot of comic content there.
Spicy though.
That's right. Correct.
And you've got to listen. The job of a staffer would surely be to actually listen to a good sample size of the episode, and it's she's edgy.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. The challenge there is those sort of podcasts will bring out from the politician a different side of their personality, which the public have not seen. And the risk there is that the punters start to get exposed to different versions of that political leader. So you've got the Albanese, the statesman, that does these formal press conferences. That is by and far the most common image someone's got of the Prime Minister. And now we're seeing a different side to him. Now, that doesn't hurt, but there's risk associated with that, because voters will eventually go, well, which version is it? Right? And so that losing authenticity in that environment is very risky. And it's something that, for example, Pauline Hanson has successfully been able to hold on to in different formats and on different platforms. She is consistent. It doesn't matter who's interviewing her. And that's skill. She may not be aware that's a skill, but it is a skill in today's complex media environment.
It is a skill, and it's a skill which comes from being in she would deny this, but she is a professional politician. She's been a professional politician for 3 decades.
Yes.
So if she hadn't acquired that skill set, you'd be concerned.
Well, no, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because what we're seeing with her is that she is able to be consistent in across numerous platforms, numerous media outlets, and on podcasts which are quite challenging, right? And what I'm saying here is that the established political players are not have not wrapped their heads around that being like the Albanese,
Melongate, mate. Call it Melongate. Say it.
Correct. Is a good example of that, and that is that's not the version Australians see on their TVs any given time they're seeing the Prime Minister, right? And so there's risks with that. There's be also positives, but what I'm saying here is that Pauline Hanson's just a lot better at it than other politicians at the moment.
Yeah, the authenticity question is quite interesting, because isn't it? The focus groups that we did last year of Gen Z and millennials, the uniform message across that was that they liked the intimacy of podcasts and long form interviews, and then there was particularly women, the young women that you interviewed for the John Curtin Research Centre, said that they liked the fact that interviewees didn't interrupt the subject, that there were considered long form answers, that they were seeing a window into the authenticity. But I think that's a really fascinating point that you make, is that you can't, if you're going to pick and choose and you're going to appear as Albanese version A on one podcast and then Albanese version B on podcast, and that goes to Angus Taylor and the rest of them, that there are dangers there in being seen to be inconsistent and insincere. So the whole point of going on a podcast is to give an impression of authenticity, but it can end up producing the polar opposite effect.
Yeah, and it's also then boils down to how, okay, well, if you are caught in making some comments which your opponents try to weaponize, and you take some time to remedy that in other environments, then again, you're going to further feed into that mix this thing about that, well, you're not actually authentic. I mean, the appropriate response should have been, "Yeah, look, it was a bit careless of me,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
it was a type of podcast that you tend to have those conversations, and yes, I'm really sorry if anyone's found it inappropriate, but it is what it is, and just move on, right? It's just like just accept it.
Yep.
Don't pretend it didn't exist. Don't roll out your female ministers to run lines as if
No,
that's
no.
going to fix it. It just doesn't work.
It's like the cover up is worse than the crime. I'm not saying crimes.
100%.
I'm not saying
Yeah.
crimes occurred here, but yeah, it looked. That's exactly what I said in the Australian cause. Just cough up, say it came across
So what?
clumsy. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And Chris Minns nailed it. Chris Minns nailed it. He did,
Yes, he did.
a presser with Elbow, talking about a new plan to stabilise the Tomago aluminium smelter there in New South Wales. And he stepped in and told journalists, sorry, the big story here is 1,000 workers now have job security. They have security for themselves and their families, and we're not going to see another community ripped up and destabilised by the government pretending that there's this magical free market with Adam Smith's invisible hand. It was a really strong and I think effective intervention, and just another example of why Chris Minns is a terrific communicator.
Should have been Elbow's lines. I mean, he was there at the same press conference, right? And that's the thing, and that is that just call it out. If you think you're getting questioned on trivial matters and you are there for a very serious subject, then just call it out, right? And just point out to the journalists, well, perhaps it's why also your industry's in trouble, because
Yes.
you tend to focus on issues that no one really cares about. And the issue, and in that case, employing 1,000 people is very grave for that 1,000 those 1,000 individuals and their families. And it's again, just be authentic, be honest. Don't be afraid to basically just have it actually call out if some journalist is not behaving correctly or trying to keep subject matter on trivial issues.
That's where there is actually something to learn from the Donald Trump.
Yes.
Despite all the megalomania, what Rose Horowitz calls the first post-literate US president, he takes on media at these press conferences. Sometimes it's terrible. It's hyper aggressive, and he'll invoke fake news, but he confronts that and draws the distinction between what's really going on out there in the real world and the inside baseball interests of the media in terms of that almost perpetual feedback cycle and loop of the Prime Minister said something which has created Melongate, and then we're just going to pursue the issue relentlessly for 2 weeks, which is totally disassociated from the fact that Australian living standards continue to backslide, and that's what's keeping people up at night. That's what is turning them off Labor and Liberal and attracting them to One Nation in the first place.
Well, the coalition spent an entire week of question time on Melongate, and again, they too are, I'd say confused and rudderless when it comes to navigating the modern world. Australians, you're right, are wanting serious politics for serious problems that they're facing, and they're getting basically soap operas fed to them, hence why they've tuned out. Over 70% of Australians last year did not read a single newspaper online or in print, paid or unpaid, subscription or non-subscription. There's a lot of Australians that have tuned out, and there's one way of getting them back, get into some serious content.
Yes, we're going to move on to serious content. I got to say, I conducted numerous vox pops, Kos, especially with my right wing mates. I've got more right wing mates than I care to admit generally in public, which I think is a good thing. If your friends are only left wing, or on the flip side, if your friends are only right wing, then you're actually not getting a good temperature read of the electorate, and most of my right-wing mates either didn't know about Melongate or when it was raised said it's a non-issue. It's a non-issue. Because it does lead. You just touched on the coalition's strategic position at the moment, and that I think Melongate. That to be the last mention of #Melongate, but it does spotlight where they're at the moment. They're polling in the high teens. I think that the highest primary vote they've got is maybe in the low 20s.
Yes.
Just want to stress to people, this is historically extraordinary. We have not seen this in the 82-year history of the Liberal Party of Australia. Because is that now structurally baked in? And I want to turn to Victoria in a moment and ask you whether, that's, maybe that can be the turning point and offer them lessons. But where are the Liberals at the moment? They don't seem to be able to translate any sense of anti-government anger, any sense of rage against the inexorable decline in living standards in Australia into support for the coalition, whether it's Liberal or the Nats.
Basically, what's left voting for them now in Australia are people who are largely in their 60s and actually own assets outright and are quite well off. I mean, that's the constituency that's voting for them. And as we've touched on numerous podcasts over the course of this year, they've lost most of their conservative working class base, particularly in the outer suburbs and regions. So these individuals now that we're talking about, these particular voters are still planning to vote for One Nation. But there is some evidence that in some parts of the country, you might see a reversal of this trend. And obviously you mentioned Victoria. So what's going on in Victoria is that you're seeing small C Conservatives that have moved to One Nation. When I say move, reported to pollsters they were moving to One Nation for a time. And the coalition vote was polling at around mid-20s. I think it got as high as 27 at one point. They're now in the low 30s. And as I touched on before, One Nation's dropped as a result of that. So Labor's been completely unsuccessful to budge its primary vote, even with its leadership change. It's still stuck in the mid-20s. So what we are seeing is that small C Conservatives in parts of Melbourne in particular have moved back to the coalition, particularly Melbourne's eastern suburbs. And for those listeners who don't live in Victoria or Melbourne, that's very much a part of Melbourne that historically has voted Liberal for a long time, and it is part of Melbourne which the Labor Party stupidly thought was their new base and boasted about it after the 2022 election. That's all coming home now. It's all coming home, and the primary vote is surging in very big ways right across that eastern pocket of Melbourne.
Can we come back to Victoria and deep dive there in a moment, Kos? Talking about going home, I want to talk very briefly about the second spiritual home of the John Curtin Research Centre, where John Curtin made his name, WA. There's actually, for a Western Australian state by-election, which is happening in Secret Harbour this coming weekend,
yes,
you would not normally get national attention spotlighting a Western Australian state by-election. Tell us about Secret Harbour and why people are saying it's important for all sides of politics.
Well, it's largely a seat that is encompassed in part of Andrew Hastie's electorate, and that's why everyone's paying attention to it. It's also going to be part of a broader narrative that One Nation's putting out there. They're going to take on Andrew Hastie. I would be very cautious in trying to suggest that whatever that result is this weekend, one could easily translate it then to the federal election. There's one thing that the Liberal Party MP in that seat, in that federal seat, has that the state Liberal machine does not have. It's called authenticity. We go back to that point, Nick, right? So Pauline Hanson's strength is authenticity, but so is Andrew Hastie's. And so he has a set of tools which very few on the Liberal side of politics has. So that could work for him. It is a totally different contest in Canning, which is the federal seat, come 2028, versus the by-election and whatever that result will be.
Yeah, as we've discussed, it's peri-urban. territory.
Yes,
It's
correct.
not. It's quantitatively and qualitatively different to the kind of outer suburban seats which
Yes.
decide elections at a state and federal level. Nonetheless, we'll be paying attention to that result because the media needs something to talk about. And I guess the other unspoken aspect is it's a 9-year-old Western Australian state Labor government. So these type of by-elections are dangerous, which leads us back into Victoria, where we are now going to get a test of what happens to a 3-term state Labor government asking for a 4th term. You've just run through those polling numbers. One Nation polling extremely well. The Liberals, obviously have improved, but Labor, a lot's happened since we last chatted. Kos, that the leadership change that we were anticipating on that Monday morning has now happened. Ben Carroll come to the job. He has come to the job with a sense of urgency and purpose and a clear message. I thought the announcement of so-called free dental care certainly grabbed my attention yesterday. But according to your polling, and there's a long way to play out here, there hasn't been an instant poll bounce. There hasn't been a sugar hit in terms of changing leader, which you've been warning about for a very long time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I actually tracked all the polls going back to early June. Labor's primary, the median, has not changed. The only thing that's changed is the coalition primary versus One Nation's primary, and as we spoke about before, coalition surged at the expense of One Nation. So Labor's staring down the barrel of a political reality that unless it could move its primary, and we can't rule that out, that it may indeed move its primary north, and we might be looking at a very different contest. But if everything still stays the same as it is, if we start opening the box in a number of other polls and we get closer to that November date, and that primary is still in the mid-20s, they're going to fit, unfortunately, in a minibus, as in they being the Labor caucus. They're going to lose in excess of 25, 30 seats unless that primary moves. Now, as I said,
which is a walloping, Kos. That's a walloping.
That's right. Correct.
That's 1990. That's 1992 stuff.
No, it's worse, much worse. The situation that Labor's facing in 2026 versus 1992, and for those listeners, the reference to 1992 is that landslide loss to Jeff Kennett.
This is we're not alive, Kos.
That's right. Many of them weren't alive. That's right.
Or they're in diapers.
That's right. Exactly. So they, the Labor Party, lost a significant number of seats, but it held on to its traditional heartland, that is the western part of Melbourne.
Its primary still would have been in the high 30s, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yes,
yeah.
Yes, and its primary in some of the seats that we used to call once upon a time safe for Labor in Victoria was in excess of 50%. They were winning on primaries alone. There isn't a single seat right now in Victoria that Labor holds that has a primary north of 35. That's the situation they're facing. So it's a very different problem. Now, Ben Carroll might indeed provide that contrast. It does take some time before the electorate does absorb the new leadership and whether the new leadership is different. But boy, does he have his work cut out for him.
I'd make 2 observations, Kos. One, Ben immediately looked like a premier. He did, and when it was on the TV or looking at the socials, I always try and stuff myself into the shoes of an ordinary voter who only has sort of fragmentary glimpses of political leaders. Ben automatically looked like a premier. He looked like he carried authority, and that was built around the reset, which he immediately went to work on, around calling the Royal Commission, explicitly saying that he wasn't Jacinda Ardern or Daniel Andrews, and then the framing reset, the policy reset around working people, around cost of living, around services, around universal free dental, which is a material issue. Now, he can do all those things, and it still may not be able to obviate the damage which brand Labor Victoria has done to itself over 12 years in terms of not looking after the people who form who created the Labor Party in the first place, Kos, and who have provided its ballast over a century and more.
Yeah. And the other thing is that you could say, objectively, you have been involved in so many, I would say, investigations, scandals, lots of controversy about this particular government, and very different to previous Labor governments in Victoria's history. So, I think the history won't judge them well, because they're a very different administration to the Brax-Brumby years, and so on and so on. Now, we could be having a very different conversation, Nick, come November, and the primary vote could be in excess of 30, and they could be nearing a result that has them getting to 45. But that's
I was going to ask you, what primary do they need, Kos?
About 32, 33 is what they need. And they need to be climbing a couple of Mount Everest to get there.
If Ben Carroll pulls this off and Labor CHQ, I think it will be one of the most startling victories in Australian electoral history, not just Victorian electoral history.
Yes.
It'll be stunning. I mean, there's a sense in which Ben can't lose. If he pulls off the victory, amazing. If he stems the bleeding, he can point to the fact that he saved the furniture, so to speak.
Oh, and if he doesn't, one could argue that, 10 years to 11 years of damage made it impossible for him. Right.
So what do you think? I'm going to put you on the spot, Kos. I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to put the blowtorch on you, mate.
Yep.
Every time we speak about Victoria, right now, I'm not asking you to make a 100% rock solid prediction, but right now, how would you see it playing out if voters were to go into the ballot box right now? What would tell listeners what the result would look like if they woke up on the Sunday morning?
Right now, and it's based on the polling numbers as they stand right now, Labor ends up with 25 seats out of 88. I think that's enough to say, isn't it? That's pretty clear.
Well, no, because there are still 63 other seats, because I want to know how they. I want to know how they split between Libs, Nats, One Nation, and then the party which we have managed not to talk about once on this pod, but we often give a little cheeky little kick to, the Greens, who seem kind of irrelevant to the debate at the moment, but may surprise and win a swag of inner city seats.
Coalition will get there off its own steam with a 32% primary vote, which I think one of the polls had it at. We got it at about 30, 31. They start to win all these three-way contests, and what is going on in Victoria is we're going to have 88 by-elections really, and a really good example is the state seat of Pakenham, which the One Nation leader is now has been earmarked to attempt to win. That seat should have gone to One Nation, because the scenario that we're seeing a few months ago was that One Nation's primary, was high enough where it was running first. The Liberals were running second or third, and Labor primary was collapsing. Now what we're seeing is the Liberal primary has gone from mid-20s to the mid-30s, and the One Nation primary has gone to the mid-20s, and One Nation preferences elect the Liberal candidate. So you're going to see a lot. That's what happens when the dial moves ever so slightly in favour of the coalition and at the expense of One Nation. They start winning a bag of seats, and One Nation gets busted down to about 2 or 3 seats in the lower house.
And then we'll be looking back. Maybe we'll look back on this time and go, well, what was all the hoo-ha about One Nation?
Well, there is a lot of hoo-ha because we've got these three-way contests, which we never had before, right? So three-way contests are going to be almost a permanent feature of the electoral landscape. It's not just confined to this state. We're going to see it at the by-election in Western Australia. We're going to see it come federal election unless something changes in those polling numbers.
Indeed, we'll be keeping a close eye on those polling numbers. Kos, thank you very much for your insights and wisdom as usual. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. You're obviously catching us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, but don't forget to refer a mate. We will catch you next week when Kos and I deep dive into the woes and existential angst of our generation, Generation X. But for now, it's ciao and arrivederci.